Alright guys, so yesterday in my Joe Rogan video, I mentioned Francesca Albanese, who is an independent expert that was commissioned by the United Nations Human Rights Council to do a report on Israel's war on Gaza. And she came out with this report saying that it is on reasonable grounds to believe that Israel is in the midst of committing a genocide. And so of course, we've gotten a whole bunch of different deranged responses to that. I'm going to show you guys here in a minute the State Department ghoul, Matthew Miller, who basically just resorted to calling her an anti-Semite instead of actually responding to the content of the report that she came out with. But I'm going to start off here with a couple other clips. So this first one is this, I think, German journalist who was doing a press event where she was answering some questions from reporters and asked just one of the dumbest things that I've ever heard in my life, and she is going to have a pretty good response to him. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
I would like to ask you, do you have a written document by the government which with a clear intent to commit genocide?
Do you think that in Rwanda and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, any government officials wrote a document saying, I want to commit genocide?
Just wondering on a...
I mean, it's short, simple clip there, guys, but this is where the rhetoric, this is where the debate around this has gotten us to. You have who's supposedly a journalist asking this expert on genocide who wrote an entire lengthy report detailing, explaining exactly why they came to that conclusion. And it seems like he just didn't read the report because his question would have been answered by the report itself. But his question is, do you have a written document from Israel saying, basically as you pointed out there, I want to commit genocide? I mean, what exact kind of document would you be looking for? Typically, when a state is in the act of committing a genocide, they don't just come out and say on paper and write a letter to the United Nations, we love genocide, we're about to do a genocide, okay, now we're doing the genocide. You know, I mean, that doesn't happen. You have to look at the actual evidence of what's happening on the ground. And yes, also you have to prove the intent aspect of genocide, which is usually the hardest part to prove. And while I do think that her response there was good, when it comes to Israel, this is probably the first time in history that we have seen a country in the act of committing a genocide been this open and brazen about admitting it. Okay, so it's one of those rare instances, and I've covered the International Court of Justice case that was brought by South Africa, where they gave numerous, dozens of different examples, from the Minister of Agriculture to the Minister of Culture and Finance and National Security, and the Minister of Defense, and Netanyahu himself, and Isaac Herzog, the president. All of these different people, where they listed out quotes of them inciting genocide, of them describing how they don't view there to be such a thing as innocent civilians, and Netanyahu bringing up the biblical story of Amalek that calls to destroy men, women, children alike. I mean, so many different examples. We just had another one here that was pointed out by Owen Jones. I saw this on my feed earlier today. So this is the Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, Israel's parliament, or their Congress, essentially. The Deputy Speaker, so not some like Marjorie Taylor Greene fringe equivalent or something that they have over there. The Deputy Speaker, okay? This is what he said. Erase Gaza. Nothing else will satisfy us. It is not acceptable that we have a terrorist authority next to Israel. Do not leave a child there to expel all the remaining ones at the end, so that they will not have a resurrection. I mean, listen, you may look at this, oh, it's Google Translate, maybe something was wrong. I don't know how Google Translate, even though sometimes it has a word here, here and there that could be off slightly. I mean, there's no way that it's off that much. It seems pretty clear what this guy is saying. Erase Gaza. Nothing else will satisfy us. I mean, he's not saying erase Hamas militants, erase Gaza. Nothing else will satisfy us. It is not acceptable that we have a terrorist authority next to Israel. I mean, again, conflating this idea with Gaza as just an entire terrorist apparatus. This is how they always talk about Gaza. And it's actually something that Albanese referenced in her report that we'll get to here in a bit. But just conflating those two things, right? This is how Israel justifies bombing civilian infrastructure and killing civilians in broad daylight, is everybody is either Hamas themselves, or they're sympathetic to Hamas, or Hamas was hiding under them or using them as a human shield. Every single person, every single building within inside Gaza, according to Israel's standards, is being used as a human shield and therefore is a valid target. And this is sort of the rhetorical, equivalent to that. Erase Gaza. So yeah, you don't have a military document or something that says explicitly we want to genocide Gaza, but you have statements like this. And I don't think you could possibly ask for much more in terms of proving the intent aspect of a genocide case. I mean, Israel is making this incredibly easy for the International Court of Justice right now. We also had a throwback clip to her responding to this other guy at the National Press Club, this event that they were having, and this was also a good back and forth here. So let's watch this real quick.
Israel did say, civilians, please leave. This is where we're targeting. So that wasn't them actually targeting civilians at that point.
As my friend Daniel Levy told the BBC journalist, and I beg your pardon, I don't mean to be rude, but can you really keep a straight face as you ask me this question? I will answer.
If you're asking civilians...
I will answer the question. Okay. There is nowhere to go. Because this, for those who are not familiar with the Gaza Strip, is a 300 square kilometers piece of land. Inhabited, it's the most crowded place on earth. And it has been, when I say carpet bombed, this is what 6,000 bombs per week do to an area which is so crowded. And this is why a war was not the response. But you know what, Tom? We already knew, because this is the sixth war that Israel has waged against Gaza. There was one in 2008.
I mean, again, she's good at this, right? She can have a back and forth with some of these extremely stupid questions. I'm thinking about asking that question, right? Oh, Israel told them, hey, flee the entire northern half of the Gaza Strip, and oh, by the way, we're going to bomb you as you're fleeing this area, right? And then we're also going to bomb the south, where we just told you to flee. But don't worry, go to Rafah. Oh, oops, sorry, now we're going to do a ground invasion of Rafah after we bombed it into oblivion. I mean, like, there's nowhere to go, as she was just pointing out there. There was never a safe place or a safe zone inside of Gaza. It never existed. Not to mention the fact that when you invade a place like this, you don't just get to like set up some arbitrary barrier or border, let alone half of the entirety of an area, in this case the northern portion of Gaza, and say, this is a kill zone, okay? All civilians need to get out of this area immediately, or we're just going to assume that you're a terrorist and kill you. You don't get to do that. That's not a humanitarian gesture to ethnically cleanse a region of Gaza and then bomb the rest of it into oblivion and then say, well, we told you to leave. We told you to leave. Oh, you have people in hospitals who will die if they're forced to flee. Oh, you have a disabled member or an elderly member or a child in your family, and so it's not, easy for you to just get up and walk through a bunch of rubble to the south. I mean, Jesus Christ, what the fuck are we talking about here? How are these the questions that our so-called like journalist class is asking? I mean, it's totally insane. Now, this is somehow even lower than those first two questions. Here we have again Matthew Miller, who himself probably belongs in The Hague right now, just giving an absolutely disgusting smear attempt against Francesca. And I'll show you guys the anti-Semitism that he's accusing her of here in a minute. But let's go ahead and listen to this back and forth.
So let me ask you, did you see or read the report made by Francesca Albanese yesterday in Geneva, what she showed was irrefutable, as far as she's concerned, irrefutable evidence that Israel engaged in genocide. Did you see the report? What is your comment on it?
I did see the report. Let me say a couple things about it. First, we have for a long-standing period of time opposed the mandate of this special rapporteur, which we believe is not productive. And when it comes to the individual who holds that position, I can't help but note a history of anti-Semitic comments that she has made that have been reported.
She made anti-Semitic comments?
She has, and comments she made in December that appeared to justify the attacks of October 7th. So I think it's important to take that into account. But with respect to the report itself, we have made clear that we believe that allegations of genocide are unfounded. But at the same time, we are deeply concerned by the number of civilian casualties in Gaza, and that's why we have press the government of Israel on multiple occasions to do everything it can to minimize those civilian casualties.
Yeah, well, okay. As some other reporter, asked him in one of these different briefings, I didn't pull it up here, but they also had a good back and forth. When he comes out here and he says, well, we're pressing them on these different issues to minimize civilian casualties. We're giving them advice on these things. It's like either they're completely ignoring any of this advice that you're giving them to care about civilian casualties or to minimize civilian casualties, or you're giving them terrible advice. Because they're killing a vast majority innocent civilians, 70% women and children. Okay, when you add in innocent men who are not Hamas militants, it could get anywhere between 85, 90+% innocent civilians that they're targeting right now. Not to mention the widespread destruction to civilian infrastructure, residential buildings, refugee camps, the water infrastructure, farmland, hospitals, I mean, everything you could possibly imagine, mosques, churches, etc., etc. So, I mean, I don't know how to respond at this point to somebody like him who's going to insist, oh, we're having these difficult conversations with them and influencing them to care about civilians. Oh, we're so heartbroken about the innocent civilians. That's why we're going to send them a couple billion more dollars in weaponry to continue doing exactly what they've been doing. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing. Now, in terms of the anti-Semitism there, again, notice how he did not get into any of the specifics of what the report is alleging. Okay, no specifics in any way, shape, and form. Okay, this is the same thing they did with the ICJ case as well. They don't talk about the details of what South Africa was alleging. They just dismiss it out of hand. Oh, it's meritless. It's counterproductive. Same thing he just said here. We think that it's not productive. This special rapporteur that the UN Human Rights Council commissioned. Why? Why is it not productive? Because she came to a conclusion that Israel is violating international law and that therefore you are complicit? And that you're then even violating domestic law because the U.S. is not legally allowed to sell weapons to a country that's in violation of international law. I mean, it's just like, or even a country that is blocking humanitarian aid. I mean, think about that, guys. With all of the obscene amounts of evidence that we have of Israel blocking aid from getting into Gaza, heavily restricting it from getting into Gaza, and the U.S. is insisting that they're not doing that. They're just gaslighting the hell out of everybody. It's gotten to a such an absurd point at this stage. It's like you just completely destroyed any remaining credibility that you could have possibly had. So he instead jumps to the anti-Semitism. Oh, I can't help but point out she has a history of anti-Semitic remarks, right? Well, let's look at it. So here from the Times of Israel. Now, this was basically a hit piece, by the way. So I'm not cherry picking. This isn't some left-wing pro-Palestinian source here that's going to warp what her history is of anti-Semitism. No. This is the Times of Israel that is doing essentially a hit piece where they are going to make as strong a case as they possibly can that she has a history of anti-Semitic remarks. So let's go ahead and look at what is actually being alleged here, right? Because I saw that from Matthew Miller and I was like, hang on a second, does she have a history of like crazy anti-Semitic remarks or something? Like, is this person a Nazi? Like, what's going on here? So I looked into it. This is what I got. A lawyer heading the UN Human Rights Council's open-ended investigation into Israel's treatment of Palestinians said during a 2014 conflict between Israel and Gaza Gaza terror groups, okay, more like Gaza civilians overwhelmingly back in 2014, but okay. She said that the Jewish lobby was in control of the United States. Okay, so I'll say this in terms of the Jewish lobby thing. You shouldn't say the Jewish lobby, okay? You should say the Israeli lobby, right? Because it's not Jewish people. Jewish people are not responsible for the actions of the government of Israel. Those need to be two completely separate things. So this is the one thing in terms of language that she's used where you could say, okay, you should have chosen different language. Now, was she intending when she said that to mean like there's some cabal of Jewish elites that are, pulling the strings behind the hand? No, what she was actually talking about here is something that is fundamentally true. We have groups here in the United States, for example, like AIPAC, like DMFI, that explicitly act on behalf of the interests of the government of Israel. Now, this also happens with other foreign governments. Okay, the Israeli lobby tends to fall under like a completely different classification, though, because of the history of the United States and how this all ended up shaking out. So the groups like AIPAC and DMFI, they don't necessarily have to register as like foreign lobbying groups, right? But these groups dump millions of dollars into U.S. elections. Right now, AIPAC is gearing up to spend, I think it was upwards of like $100 million in the upcoming election. Who are they spending money against? Any critics of Israel. People like Ilhan Omar, people like Rashida Tlaib, people like AOC, people like Jamal Bowman. That's who they're spending against, okay? And you have guys like John Fetterman, one of the most deranged defenders of Israel right now. Back when he was running his primary campaign against Conor Lamb, he was scared of groups like DMFI and AIPAC spending against him and in favor of his primary opponent. And so he basically, when The Intercept did great reporting on this, he basically went to DMFI and said, here, you guys can write my Israel policy. Just don't spend against me. And they effectively did. And now look, he's one of the most aggressive pro-Israel, defenders in Congress. This is how this shit works. This is not a secret. It's not something that's specific to Jewish people, certainly not. It's not even specific to Israel. It's not even specific to foreign governments. This is how US politics works. We have a system of completely legalized corruption and bribery, where corporations and lobbying groups can fund campaigns, and guess what? Over 90% of the time in this country, the person with more money in their campaign ends up winning the elections. That's how this shit works. So it is obvious corruption, it is obvious bribery. But again, you shouldn't use the word Jewish lobby, it's the Israeli lobby, right? So I would criticize that, but to pretend as if that's somehow emblematic of her being like a neo-Nazi or something, no. They continue here, because the other examples, that was the strongest example. That was the only one that I read in this entire article that could, I think, like reasonably be interpreted as like, okay, that's borderline anti-Semitism, right? Only if you sort of like misconstrue the underlying point. But they say, okay, a review of her past social media posts, media appearances, and talks with activist groups found that aside from inveighing against the Jewish lobby, which, by the way, she also apologized for. She came out and later apologized for using this language. But she has also sympathized with terrorist organizations, dismissed Israeli security concerns, compared Israelis to Nazis, and accused the Jewish state of potential war crimes. So I just want to note, before we get to more of this, that, like, this article is more anti-Semitic than anything that I've seen that Francesca has said, okay? Because what this article is doing is it is conflating the government of Israel with Jewish people. The actions, the war crimes, the genocide of the government of Israel, and saying that is the same thing if you criticize that as criticizing Judaism or criticizing Jewish people, right? This article is anti-Semitic in their critique of Francesca as being anti-Semitic. I mean, accuse the Jewish state of potential war crimes. So you can't even say that Israel has committed war crimes, which they've done in broad daylight on camera. We've all seen it over and over and over again for 6 months straight now. You can't even say that, or that's anti-Semitic. No, I mean, it's just like, it's absolutely absurd. Compared Israelis to Nazis. Again, how is that anti-Semitic? I'm not saying that the current iteration of the Israeli state is exactly like the Nazis. I mean, obviously, there's kind of a discrepancy there in terms of the massacre, the Holocaust of Jewish people, but in terms of the overlap on fascism, and in terms of the overlap on a sort of like racial or ethnically based supremacy, sure, yeah. I mean, you know, it's not like it's just a completely unreasonable comparison here. I mean, look at the rhetoric that I just showed you guys, and all of the other rhetoric we talked about before. That's not a crazy anti-Semitic comparison. And when they say sympathize with terrorist organizations, it's interesting because this, to me, is just a total spin on what she's actually said. The things that I've read that she said are things like Palestinians have a right to self-defense, which is a fundamentally accurate statement under international law. But apparently that means she came out and she was like, I love Hamas and I love when Hamas kills civilians. I mean, all of this is just so dishonest. It gets even better. They say, then, as now, she refers to Israel as a settler colonial enterprise and to Jews in Israel and the pre-state British mandate as foreign interlopers subjugating an indigenous Palestinian population. What the fuck are we talking about? This is, even the earliest Zionists called their own movement settler colonial. This is not something that's anti-Semitic. It has nothing even remotely in the realm of anti-Semitism. It wouldn't have mattered if it was Jewish people going and colonizing Palestine, if it was anybody else, if it was European Christians who were doing the same thing, right? Then there still would have been resistance from the Palestinian population. It still would have been an ethnic displacement, regardless of who was doing it. I mean, this is like looking at the foundation of the United States of America when a bunch of colonists came over and started displacing Native Americans and killing and massacring Native Americans. And then you describe that history as a genocide, and then somebody turns around and says, oh, what, so you hate white people? And I shouldn't even use that as an example because there are many conservatives who would come to that conclusion and say you hate white people if you point out the genocide of Native Americans at the foundation of the U.S. But, I mean, it's the same thing here. This is just an accurate description of the foundation of the State of Israel. In her official report to the UN this year, she urged the rejection of the conflict paradigm, describing Israel solely as an oppressor and legitimizing Palestinian resistance. I mean, Palestinians under international law, as an occupied people, illegally occupied, they do have a right to resistance. That's a fact under international law. Now, what that doesn't mean is it doesn't mean any Palestinian group has a right to go and massacre civilians in Israel. No, you don't have that right. That's still a war crime. but they do have a right to resistance against the IDF or against Israeli security forces or against violent settlers who are terrorizing them and trying to forcefully push them off of their lands. They do have a right to resistance against that. That's not even really controversial, or it shouldn't be controversial. And there is a question there too of like, you know, we hear this line over and over and over again, Israel has a right to self-defense, Israel has a right to self-defense, and all of that. And it's like, it's a very easy line to say, but under international law, it gets a lot murkier. An occupying power actually does not have a right to self-defense in the way that people typically understand it against a people that they are occupying. They have a right to protect their own, you know, citizens within Israel. Yeah. But it's not the same thing as a war between two states. This is a war between, it's a totally asymmetrical war, if you can even call it a war, between an occupied people and the people who are occupying them. It's not, you know, it's not really comparable there, especially not in terms of military power. And so I'll leave this down below because I don't want this video to go on for like an hour, but I'll leave down the actual report here. It's called An Anatomy of Genocide. And this was Francesca's conclusions, and they have a summary up here, and then the recommendations that she's giving, and then the entire report. It's about 25 pages long. It's down there. A couple main points that I highlighted here. I mean, the recommendations are very interesting. You know, immediate arms embargo on Israel. She also calls for potential sanctions and economic pressure if they do not abide by an immediate ceasefire. You know, there needs to be transparent investigations, which obviously Israel has not been allowing for. You know, ensure that Israel, as well as the states like the U.S., who have been complicit in the genocide, acknowledge the colossal harm done, and then, you know, pay reparations and help to rebuild Gaza once this is inevitably over. I mean, a lot of different, you know, interesting points that she made throughout this. So I do recommend, if you want to hear the details of exactly what she pointed out in this article, go read it. You can go read it for yourself, you know, and come to your own conclusion as to whether or not you think that it's convincing. Okay? But one thing that you can't do is just refuse to read the report, or read the report and then just blank it out of your mind and then just turn around and say anybody who criticizes Israel or says they're settler colonial or that they commit war crimes, that they're anti-Semitic. I mean, what a fucking disgusting, lazy response there from Matthew Miller. It's very typical, though. We also had this, of course, just as a reminder, our interpretation of the UN Security Council resolution on the Gaza ceasefire is non-binding. I mean, this is like what the US is doing in the meantime, as they're calling UN experts on genocide anti-Semitic for accusing Israel of genocide. You know, they're also doing things like this, just completely detached from reality. Non-binding. It is binding. They just made this up. UN Security Council resolutions are binding, legally. If you are a signatory to the United Nations, and you're a member of the UNSC, it's a binding resolution. But they just came out afterwards, because they don't actually want to push for an immediate, you know, unconditional ceasefire. They just come out and they're like, no, it's non-binding. It's like, okay, so you just are admitting you do not believe in international law. You believe that the United States, because we're the most powerful military baddies in the world, that we can just ignore international law entirely. And by extension, so do all of our friends. They also get to completely ignore international law. Non-binding. I mean, what the fuck? We also had this. U.S. says Israel's using our weapons in line with international law and is not blocking Gaza aid. I mean, I mentioned this before, but I don't know how else to describe this. It's completely detached from reality. It's beyond just a lie. You would have to disbelieve every single major reputable human rights organization in the world. You would have to disbelieve the United Nations, the ICJ, this UN Special Rapporteur. You would have to disbelieve the absolute fact that children are dying from famine right now. You would have to disbelieve the Israeli politicians who have openly admitted that they're blocking the aid. You would have to disbelieve even your own government, the US government, that is dropping aid from the skies and building a port supposedly to deliver aid to Gaza. Why are you doing that? Why are you dropping aid from the skies and building a port to facilitate aid? Could it have anything to do with Israel restricting the aid from getting in? No, according to the United States, no, they're not blocking aid. I don't even know what to say at this point, guys. You can go look at the miles-long lines of trucks that are sitting at the border, desperately trying to get in, and see the IDF turning all of them around. What the fuck are we even supposed to say at this point? Finishing off with this, I mean, of course, the U.S., after Biden came out and said, oh, I have a red line, it's Rafah, right? And then he immediately backtracked in the same sentence, and he was like, well, it's kind of a red line for Israel to not invade Rafah, but I'm still going to keep giving them weapons. I'm not going to actually use any leverage to stop them from invading Rafah. And now that has turned into this. U.S. pushes to shape Israel's Rafah operation, not to stop it. So, I mean, with an article like that, as I was telling you guys weeks ago, a Rafah invasion seems totally inevitable at this point and imminent, right? And when this inevitably happens, this absolutely catastrophic, horrific humanitarian catastrophe that we're witnessing right now, a man-made catastrophe for that matter, is going to get infinitely worse. Somehow, it's going to get infinitely worse. And this is something that the U.S. is well aware of. It's not as if Matthew Miller, it's not as if Joe Biden, it's not as if the rest of these guys don't know what's going on. They know what's going on. You really think that the U.S. State Department, with all of their intelligence, with all of their resources, the money that they have at their disposal, with all of that they have no idea that Israel has committed war crimes? They have no idea that Israel is blocking the aid. I mean, you'd have to be totally delusional to actually buy into that line of logic.